The night split open with a scream so sharp it cut the silence like glass. James said, "Stay inside, don't move." He stood on the back porch clutching a flashlight, the cold beam trembling as it lit up the thick tree line. His wife Sarah whispered, "It's too close," her voice quivering with panic. The air was heavy, damp, filled with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. A low growl echoed from the shadows, guttural and deep, not belonging to any animal James knew. His daughter Emily pressed her small hands against the window, whispering, "It's watching us." The crunch of heavy footsteps broke through the darkness, closer and closer, until the ground itself seemed to shiver. James' heart hammered as the beam of his light caught a massive imprint in the mud, shaped like a foot but impossibly large. He said, "God help us," the words barely a breath. The growl rose again, closer now, wrapping around the family like a warning, a promise of what waited in the dark beyond the trees. The silence returned, but it was not comforting. James stood frozen on the porch, every muscle taut as though the ground itself threatened to break open. Sarah whispered, "We need to call someone," her voice low and trembling. Emily pressed closer to the glass, whispering, "It's still out there." James felt the weight of the night pressing in on him, the air thick and unbreathable. The woods seemed alive, every shifting shadow carrying menace. He took a step forward, the wooden boards creaking beneath him like a warning. His breath came in short bursts, each exhale visible in the cold. The footprint lingered in his mind like a curse, too clear to dismiss, too impossible to explain. Somewhere deep among the trees, a branch snapped, sharp and deliberate. James said, no one would believe this, and for the first time, he wondered if even he could. James' phone shook in his hand as he tried dialing, but the signal was gone, replaced by static. Sarah said, "It doesn't want us to call." Emily gasped, pointing toward the tree line, where shadows bent unnaturally with the wind. James' heart sank, his mind refusing to believe what his eyes caught. The night pressed closer, as though the house itself was shrinking. A heavy thud echoed from the woods, not like footsteps but something dropped from above. The sound rattled through James' chest. Sarah whispered, "We can't stay here." James clenched the useless phone, anger rising with his fear. He said, "I'll prove this is real," his voice unsteady. In that moment, he was no longer trying to protect them. He was fighting the unseen to preserve his own sanity. The wind rose suddenly, howling through the trees like voices carried on the night. Emily whimpered, hiding her face against her toy, while Sarah grabbed James' arm. "It's hunting us," she said, her voice breaking. James wanted to deny it, but the truth pressed harder than reason. The howl was not just the wind, it carried rhythm, breath, something alive. He stepped back, shutting the porch door with a slam that echoed too loud. Silence followed, deep and suffocating. Then came the scrape of claws against wood, slow and deliberate, right outside the wall. Emily cried, "Make it stop." James held her close, but his eyes never left the trembling door frame. The house was no longer a refuge, it was a cage. The scratching at the walls grew louder, circling the house, relentless in its intent. James whispered, "It's testing us," his breath shallow. Sarah clutched his hand, her knuckles white, as though holding him kept reality intact. Emily's small sobs filled the silence, piercing and raw. A sudden bang on the window made all three of them jump, glass vibrating violently. James swung the flashlight beam toward it, but the light caught nothing, only their own reflections staring back with hollow fear. For a moment, James thought he saw eyes glinting beyond the glass, yellow and unblinking, but they vanished as quickly as they appeared. His body trembled with the realization that they were not alone, and that whatever circled them was intelligent, deliberate, waiting. The night finally gave way to a heavy dawn, gray light seeping through the blinds, yet the house felt colder than ever. James sat in silence at the kitchen table, his hands clasped tight, staring at the muddy boot prints he had tracked in. Sarah brewed coffee, though she barely touched the cup, her eyes red from a sleepless night. Emily sat at the end of the table, clutching her toy, asking, "Will it come back?" James' throat tightened, but he could not give her comfort. Outside, the forest stood quiet, almost too quiet, as though holding its breath. James whispered, "It left something behind," recalling the print burned into his memory. Sarah replied, "Maybe we imagined it," her tone begging for reassurance. James' voice sharpened. "I know what I saw." The distance between them grew heavier, filled with the weight of disbelief. Somewhere deep inside, James feared that silence was worse than the growls. It meant the thing was waiting. James stepped outside, the weak morning sun cutting pale streaks through the fog that clung to the yard. He crouched over the muddy ground, staring at the enormous footprint that hadn't faded overnight. He muttered, "It's real no matter what they say." Sarah stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, her voice trembling. "Don't get too close." James traced the outline of the print with his hand, his fingers trembling as if touching something sacred and cursed. Emily peered out the doorway, whispering, "It's bigger than you." The forest loomed silent, branches slick with dew, and every creak of wood echoed like a warning. Sarah's voice cracked, "We need to tell someone," but James shook his head, fear and anger blending. "They'll laugh at us," he said, his tone bitter. His obsession was already taking root, pushing reason further away. Later that morning, James drove into town, his mind clouded with dread and determination. At the local diner, the air was thick with coffee and fried food, but conversation hushed when he entered. A group of men sat at the counter, whispering, their glances sharp. James walked to the booth where old Henry sat, the town's keeper of forgotten tales, his weathered face unreadable. Henry said, "You saw it, didn't you?" James froze, stunned that no explanation was needed. He leaned in, whispering, "It left prints in my yard." Henry's eyes darkened, his voice low, "That thing has been here longer than any of us." A man at the counter laughed loudly, saying, "Another fool chasing shadows." James clenched his fists, his face burning, the mockery twisting his fear into anger. Henry warned, "Mock them if you like, but it doesn't stop what's coming." The whispers followed James out of the diner, mockery clinging to him like smoke. Sarah called him on the phone, her voice panicked. "Emily swears she saw it in the trees again." His blood ran cold, and he drove back faster than he thought possible, tires grinding against gravel. When he pulled into the driveway, Emily stood at the window, pale and shaking. She pointed toward the woods, where shadows seemed deeper than they should be. James ran inside, heart pounding, pulling Sarah close as she trembled. "It wasn't just in your head," he told her. Sarah shook, tears on her cheeks, whispering, "Then it's not leaving us alone." James stared out into the tree line, where the silence carried weight, and swore to himself that he'd prove to everyone this nightmare was real. That night, unease settled thicker than the fog outside. James sat by the window with the flashlight resting across his knees, refusing to sleep. Sarah sat near him, her hands gripping a blanket, whispering, "You're scaring Emily with this obsession." James said, "I'm not obsessed, I'm prepared." Emily appeared in the hallway, her small voice trembling. "It was at my window." Sarah's breath caught, fear breaking through her doubt. James rushed to Emily, kneeling down, gripping her shoulders, whispering, "What did you see?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. It was tall, with glowing eyes staring at me. The words chilled him because they matched what he had feared all along. The family huddled together as the house groaned in the night, every sound threatening to confirm the terror waiting just beyond the walls. The following morning, James found new tracks pressed deep into the mud, larger and heavier than before, circling the yard as if marking territory. His stomach churned as he muttered, "It knows where we live." Sarah stood behind him on the porch, pale and hollow, whispering, "Maybe it's warning us." Emily clung to her mother's side, her small face hidden in Sarah's robe. James crouched low, measuring the tracks with his hand, his eyes wide with disbelief. The prints cut straight through the fence, splintered wood scattered like toothpicks. The world he once trusted no longer made sense. Sarah said, "We can't stay here." James's jaw tightened, his voice harsh. "If we run, it'll follow." The morning sun broke through, but the light brought no comfort, only the cruel clarity that something unnatural stalked them openly. James returned to town, carrying a photograph of the footprint on his phone, desperate for proof. At the sheriff's office, he slammed the phone on the desk, saying, "Look at this." Sheriff Miller leaned back, unimpressed, muttering, "Tracks wash up, James. Could be anything." James' voice rose. "It tore through my fence." Miller sighed, shaking his head. "Folks are on edge already. Last thing we needed is another monster story." Rage burned in James' chest, but beneath it was helplessness. No authority would stand with him. As he stormed out, Henry sat outside smoking, eyes following him knowingly. Henry said, "You'll never get them to believe. They don't want to." The words dug deep, because James realized belief wasn't just about proof, it was about fear people refused to face. That evening, James sat in his truck at the edge of the woods, engine off, silence pressing in. His flashlight rested on the seat beside him, his breath fogging the windshield. He muttered, "You're out there, aren't you?" Branches creaked above, and in the fading light, something massive moved between the trees. The silhouette was tall, impossibly broad, and vanished before his eyes could adjust. Fear gripped him, but curiosity rooted him in place. Sarah called his phone, her voice frantic. "Come home now. Emily swears it's watching again." His knuckles whitened on the wheel as he started the engine, headlights cutting into the dense forest. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, as though guiding him away. For the first time, James realized the creature wasn't just passing through. It was circling them, closer each time. Back at the house, Sarah locked every door and window, pacing the living room with trembling hands. Emily sat curled on the couch, whispering, "It was staring at me right at my window." James stormed in, breathless, muttering, "I saw it too." Sarah snapped, "You keep feeding this thing by chasing it." Her fear spilled into anger, desperate to shield their daughter. James dropped into a chair, burying his face in his hands, whispering, "It won't stop until we face it." The house felt smaller than ever, every shadow stretching longer, every creak like claws. Emily clutched her toy tight, her voice soft but certain. "It's waiting for us." The words chilled both parents, because her innocence left no room for doubt. What she saw was real. That night, the scratching returned, louder than before, circling the house in deliberate rhythm. James held the flashlight tightly, whispering, "It's testing us." Sarah pulled Emily close, her eyes wide with terror, muttering, "It knows we're trapped." A heavy thud shook the wall, dust falling from the ceiling, the sound unnatural in its weight. James shouted into the darkness, "Show yourself." But the only reply was silence. Then, from the far window, two faint yellow eyes glowed, unblinking, watching. Emily buried her face against her mother, sobbing, while Sarah froze, unable to move. James stood rooted, the beam of his flashlight shaking as he pointed it at the glass, but the eyes vanished in an instant, leaving only their reflections. The fear no longer lived in the woods. It lived inside the walls of their home. James met Henry behind the diner, where the alley smelled of rain and old coffee. Henry said, "Your yard isn't the first." He handed over a leather journal, its spine cracked and soft with age. James opened to a page of sketches showing huge prints beside a farmhouse. Henry said, "Your grandfather drew those after a winter hunt went wrong." The drawings showed trees marked with a crooked rune. James whispered, "I've seen that mark on our fence." Henry nodded, eyes dim, as if reliving a debt unpaid. He said, "It follows names, not places." The words pressed cold into James' chest. He felt the weight of a history he had never been told. Henry added, "It learns the rhythms of a family." James said, "Then it isn't wandering." The truth landed like a stone dropped in a well with no bottom. Back home, James spread the journal across the kitchen table, while the house creaked with settling cold. Emily traced a drawing of the rune and hummed a slow, rising pattern. Sarah said, "Where did you learn that?" Emily answered, "From the wind last night." The tune matched a note scrawled in the margin, a cadence marked, "Call and answer." James said, "It listens for us, then it answers." He ran a finger down a page titled, "December, the Watching." The notes described eyes in the windows and steps that paused at doors. Sarah whispered, "This isn't random." A shiver moved through the room like a draft that found every seam. James said, "It knows our habits." He closed the book, and the lamp flickered, as if the house heard and held its breath. A pickup rolled into the driveway, and Mark stepped out with a toolbox and a grin that did not reach his eyes. Mark said, "Heard you needed gear." He unpacked motion sensors, sleek and unfamiliar, wires coiled like veins. Sarah said, "Who told you we needed this?" Mark replied, "Everyone's talking." James watched him fix a device to the eave where swallows used to nest, then gave off a faint hum that sat low in the chest. Henry's warning rang in James' head, and doubt folded into unease. Mark said, "This will draw it close, then we get proof." James said, "How do you know that?" Mark looked away, phone buzzing in his pocket. Through the screen reflection, James saw a text thread with Miller's name at the top. Night fell hard, and the new devices pulsed with a rhythm that set teeth on edge. Emily said, "It doesn't like that sound." From the tree line came a reply, slow and heavy, like breath turned into thunder. James dimmed the lamps and watched the yard flatten into a gray plain. He said, "If it comes, we don't run." Sarah whispered, "We shouldn't be the bait." The sensors ticked, and the porch light cut out with a soft pop. In the dark, a figure moved between the pines, stopping where the rune had been carved. It raised an arm, not in attack, but in recognition, as if marking attendance. James said, "It knows us by pattern." The truth carried a strange mercy that felt worse than cruelty. A latch clicked, and the front door locked from the outside with a smooth, practiced motion. Mark said, "Stay quiet, and we get everything on camera." Sarah pounded the door, voice raw, "Open it now." From the yard came that breathing thunder, closer, circling the porch. James shouted, "You're using us." Mark said, "Proof pays. Panic pays more." A shadow crossed the window, tall and patient. Henry's truck rumbled into the road and cut its engine. Henry called, "This isn't the way." Mark raised a hand, but the yard fell still, as if listening for a verdict. The lock refused to turn, and the devices hummed in answer. James said, "It doesn't want the trap, it wants us." The camera light blinked, and the darkness blinked back. The night exploded with sound, branches cracking like gunfire as something vast pressed against the walls. Emily screamed, clutching Sarah as the windows rattled in their frames. James gripped the flashlight, shouting, "Stay away from the glass." The porch groaned under weight, too heavy for timber. Sarah whispered, "It's trying to come inside." The devices Mark had planted flickered red, their hum growing sharper, vibrating through the walls. Outside, a silhouette moved between shadows, broader than the doorway, its eyes glowing like molten embers. James' pulse pounded, each beat louder than the next. Emily cried, "It knows we're here." Mark yelled from outside, "Hold your ground!" His words felt hollow, drowned by the slow scrape of claws dragging along the siding. The house itself trembled, as though bracing against a storm made of flesh and rage. The porch collapsed with a roar, splinters flying inward as Sarah dragged Emily behind the couch. James aimed the beam into the swirling dust, shouting, "Show yourself." For a heartbeat, the figure stood revealed, tall, hunched, matted fur glistening with dew, its chest rising like a furnace. Its eyes burned through the dust, unblinking. James froze, unable to breathe. Sarah cried, "James, don't!" But he stepped closer, driven by equal parts fear and defiance. The creature tilted its head, almost human, before vanishing into the shadows again. The silence that followed was worse than the crash. Emily whispered, "It wanted you to see it." James' hand shook violently, the flashlight beam scattering across the broken boards. For the first time, he realized the thing wasn't hiding. It was choosing when to be seen. Mark rushed in through the broken porch, camera raised, yelling, "I got it! I got it!" His voice cracked with manic triumph. Sarah screamed, You'll get us killed." The lens caught a glimpse of movement, and then the camera was torn from his hands, smashed against the wall. Mark stumbled back, bleeding from his cheek. James shouted, "You brought this on us." The creature's growl shook the air, rattling picture frames from the walls. Emily sobbed, her voice breaking, "Please stop fighting." Mark tried to scramble toward the door, but the lock refused him, the devices humming louder. James realized then, Mark wasn't baiting the creature. He was baiting them. And the monster answered not to fear, but to betrayal. James clenched his fists, fury rising to match the terror consuming the room. The growl became a roar, shaking dust from rafters as the walls groaned under unseen weight. James grabbed a broken board, shouting, "If it wants us, it'll have to fight for it." Sarah cried, "You'll die out there," but his body surged with desperate courage. He kicked the shattered door open and stepped into the fog-choked yard. The figure emerged, towering, fur slick with mist, its breath steaming like smoke. James' heart hammered, yet his voice rang out, "I'm not afraid of you." The creature tilted its head, eyes burning, and stepped forward, each footfall sinking deep into the earth. Behind him, Sarah clutched Emily, screaming his name, but James no longer heard. The world shrank to him, the fog, and the beast. The beast lunged, faster than thought, and James swung wildly, the board shattering against its chest. It staggered, but did not fall. James fell back, breath ripped from his lungs, staring into eyes that held no malice, only calculation. The creature leaned close, its breath hot and sour, and rumbled a sound like words twisted into growls. Sarah screamed, "James!" and Emily wailed, "Don't let it take him!" Mark stumbled outside, aiming a broken sensor like a weapon, shouting, "Stay back!" The beast swatted it aside, sparks hissing as the device died. For one suspended moment, James thought he saw recognition in its gaze, as if it marked him for something greater than prey. Then it stepped back into the fog, vanishing, leaving silence heavy as stone. James collapsed to his knees, knowing the fight had only begun. The yard was silent again, but silence no longer meant safety. James knelt in the dirt, his breath ragged, hands trembling as he pressed against the broken ground where the creature had stood. Sarah guided Emily back inside, her arms wrapped tight as if shielding her from the memory itself. Mark sat slumped near the ruined sensor, his face pale, muttering, "I only wanted proof." His words felt thin, eaten by the cold air. James said, "It doesn't care what we want." His voice cracked, filled with exhaustion. Inside, the house sagged under the weight of damage, splintered frames, shattered boards, dust hanging heavy. Emily whispered, "It let us live," her voice soft, almost questioning. James closed his eyes, gripping soil in his fist. He didn't know if survival was mercy or punishment. The night was over, but the terror had settled inside them, impossible to bury. Inside, Sarah moved through the wrecked living room, picking up shattered frames and broken glass, her hands shaking. James stood in the doorway, guilt pressing deeper than fear. Sarah said, "This house isn't ours anymore." Her voice broke, quiet but sharp. Emily clutched her toy, staring at the window where glowing eyes had watched her. She whispered, "It will come back." James knelt beside her, trying to form words, but none felt true. Mark leaned against the wall, holding a rag to his wound, muttering, "You can't stop it." The truth rang bitter, because James knew he was right. Sarah's eyes brimmed with tears, her voice trembling. "We can't tell anyone," James said. "They wouldn't believe us anyway." The weight of silence pressed over them, heavier than the beast's shadow. The fight had ended, but the story was unfinished. Later, Henry entered quietly, his boots heavy on broken boards. He looked at James with a sorrow that carried years of memory. Henry said, "It doesn't stop until it marks the bloodline." Sarah turned pale, whispering, "What do you mean?" Henry pulled the journal from his coat, laying it on the table with pages already opened. Drawings of faces, generations marked, all ending unfinished. Emily peered over, her fingers brushing the ink. Henry muttered, "It always leaves one, so the line never ends. James slammed his hand on the table, anger mixed with despair. So we were never safe. Henry shook his head, his voice low. You never were. The room fell silent as the reality pressed in. Emily's small whisper cut through. Then it's my turn, isn't it? Sarah pulled her close, her tears falling on her daughter's hair. That evening, Sarah boarded the broken windows, her hands raw from nails and wood. James sat nearby, staring into the dying fire, his thoughts drowning in shadows. Mark lingered at the doorway, muttering, I'll leave at first light. His tone carried shame, but no apology. Sarah said, Go, but don't take the story with you. Her voice was sharp, tired, unflinching. James whispered, We can't outrun this. The house groaned as the wind moved through cracks, each sound carrying memory of claws. Emily lay curled on the couch, finally asleep, though her face twitched in restless dreams. Henry sat silently, pipe unlit, watching the fire with hollow eyes. No one dared to speak further, because words no longer mattered. The night stretched on long and heavy, every heartbeat carrying the echo of what had been inside their walls. Morning came gray and heavy, the forest wrapped in mist. James stepped outside, the ground damp with dew, his eyes fixed on the tree line. The ruined sensor lay twisted in the grass, useless. Mark's truck rolled away down the gravel road, its sound fading. Sarah joined James on the porch, her face hollow, whispering, What if it waits for her? James shook his head, but his silence betrayed the truth. Emily appeared at the doorway, clutching her toy, her voice soft. I dreamed it followed me. James knelt, gripping her hands, whispering, I'll keep you safe. But deep inside, he knew promises meant nothing. Henry walked toward the woods, his voice gravelly, It always returns. The mist swallowed him slowly, leaving only silence. James looked at his family, then back at the forest, knowing peace had not returned, only pause. Morning brought voices instead of claws, and they were almost worse. A neighbor said, Saw your porch online, with a smile that asked for spectacle. Sheriff Miller shrugged, storm damage and panic. Mark's video crawled across phones, chopped into cheap fear and ad breaks. James watched comments flood with laughter and theories that felt like knives. Sarah cleaned glass in tight circles, whispering, Let them think what they want. Emily stood at the edge of the room and listened to the trees. Henry smoked on the steps, his stare fixed on the tree line like a man counting debts. He said, Noise is a blanket. It hides the thing that waits. James looked at the broken boards and felt the silence beneath the noise. The house breathed shallow, as if saving air for night. By afternoon, the wind carried a stale sweetness, like berries gone to rot. Emily hummed the slow rise and fall from the journal, not knowing she did it. Sarah said, Sweetie, not that song, and her voice cracked on the last word. James traced fresh scratches in the new boards, and felt the rhythm match Emily's tune. He said, We're leaving tonight, but the house tightened around the promise. Henry closed the journal with a soft thud and said, It travels lighter than we do. Mark texted, asking for one last interview, and James powered the phone down. The trees went still, as if the whole ridge leaned close to listen. Dusk gathered early, and laid a hand on the roof. They packed, as if the act could erase latitude. James carried boxes to the truck, while Sarah wrapped frames with hands that would not steady. Emily asked, Will it know where we go? Henry answered, It already does, and the answer made the road feel useless. The sun slid behind the ridge, and the yard cooled to iron. From the fence came a faint tapping, like a knuckle counting, then it stopped. James set the last box down, and stared at the tree line that held their names. He said, We leave at first dark, but the shadows had already chosen the time. The engine coughed and settled into a nervous idle. Twilight took the yard in one slow breath. James said, Now, and they moved in practiced quiet that still felt loud. Sarah buckled Emily while Henry slid the journal under the seat. The radio flickered and found static shaped like a voice calling from underwater. Mark's truck appeared at the end of the lane, and then backed away, shame turning his headlights. From the woods rose that breathing thunder, softer than before, closer than before. James gripped the wheel and said, eyes forward, but his own drifted to the porch. The door, which he had locked twice, swung open just a few inches. The house exhaled as if relieved to be rid of them. They rolled onto the road, gravel whispering like a warning the tires could not hear. The forest paced them in parallel, a black seam stitched to their window. Emily whispered, "It's humming with me," and her breath fogged the glass in a slow rhythm. Sarah said, "Don't look," but the command arrived too late to matter. In the rear view, James saw the porch light blink once, as if answering a distant signal. Ahead the fog pooled low and deep, swallowing the lane until the world narrowed to a tunnel. The radio, dead moments before, clicked alive and matched Emily's tune note for note. Henry stared forward and did not blink. The final truth landed without sound. The print on the windshield bloomed from inside.